Dennis Alexander, the director of the Faraday Institute, and I'd just like to add my very warm welcome to that of Rodney Holder. It's wonderful to see so many people here from a very wide spectrum of countries. Now, I don't normally pick on one particular country because I know we've got many countries represented, and I'm always worried about missing one country out. But I did think we ought to give a especially warm welcome to the group that have come over from Romania. Weekend, and we'd like to give you a warm welcome especially, and for John Stone, who's come from Paris, who's come along with this group, and we're so delighted that you can come to Cambridge for this time, and we do look forward to some really valuable interactions and discussions over the weekend. I'm sure all the speakers would agree, as we certainly do in the Faraday, that we're here for discussion, for open debate. We certainly don't have all the answers, or even some of them sometimes, on some of these big questions of life, and so we're delighted we're going to have plenty of time for debates and discussion, and I hope that everyone will feel free to join in those times and to engage with these topics. We're also delighted that Professor John Hedley Brooke has agreed to come and open the weekend. Actually, to be quite honest, we've been trying to get John to come and speak for the past year, but he's been very, very busy, and up until a few months ago he was still the professor of the history of science and religion, or science and religion, at Oxford University, and has now given that up to Peter Harrison, in fact, who's going to come quite shortly to take up that chair. But I know John is still very, very busy with a lot of writing responsibilities and also with a lot of speaking at conferences. John has made enormous contributions to the whole field of the history of science and religion in this country and indeed internationally, and I'm sure many of his books will be familiar to many of us here. Some of them are on the bookstall at the back. I very much hope so. I'm assuming that's the case. They're certainly on our list, and I hope that you'll make the opportunity to buy those. He's also former editor of the British Journal for the History of Science. He's been president of the British Society for the History of Science, and also the historical section of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and gave lectures during the mid-1990s together with Geoffrey Cantor from Leeds. The outcome of that was again a very, very valuable book, which I suspect is known to some of us here. So enormously engaged in this whole field, and we're delighted he's going to give us two overviews really of the historical relationship between science and religion. One will be tonight, and one tomorrow morning, and so I'll hand straight over to you, John. Thank you.
You'll see from my rather grandiose title there on the PowerPoint that I was Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford, and that actually has led to some very interesting encounters with people who, when I've met them, have denied that it's possible. They've in effect said that I could not possibly be a professor of science and religion. The clear implication, of course, was that the one must somehow exclude the other, and therefore I must have had a kind of imploding chair. There is a sense in which this talk is, I think, an answer to that question. Though I must say I never quite had the wit to produce it on the spur of the moment when I was so confronted. Because, of course, one question one can ask straight away is, has religion been a friend to science, or has it been an enemy? Equally, has science been a friend to religion, or has it been an enemy? And as soon as you ask those questions, of course, you're thrown into a historical inquiry, because you cannot answer those questions without looking at the past. So I really make no apology for the fact that this talk is called Historical Interactions, because unless we look at the past, I think we may well get the story wrong. However, that doesn't solve any problem, because a few weeks ago I heard somebody say on the radio, we all know that science and religion existed in harmony for centuries, and that it's only in the modern period that conflict has broken out. So we might call that the old friends, new enemies story. But the other person I heard with equal authority, and only a day or so later, second person with equal assurance said, for centuries, science and religion existed in conflict until now, when peace, or at least the potential for peace, has finally arrived. This, we might say, is the old enemy's new friends story. Well, I'm sure it's clear to you, as it is to me, that it isn't clear how both those stories can be true. And the contradiction between them immediately suggests, of course, that the formulas are too crude. Each of those two stories is deeply problematic because of the level of generality at which it's told. When we place science in opposition to religion, as many do, we may seem to be accepting a contradiction, that the one somehow ought to exclude the other. Darwin's convert, Thomas Henry Huxley, put it like this: it is impossible to be a soldier for science and a loyal son of the church. So we might just remind ourselves of Huxley there doing his anthropology and craniology. Or as Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, put it, the practice of science does not accord with the priestly temperament. What I want to suggest this evening is that too much of our thinking about science and religion is ruled by an uncritical acceptance of the dichotomies and the supposed contradictions that pervade popular discussion. In short, there are good reasons, I think, why a little history can complicate the picture. Now, since Dennis very generously referred to one of my books, I'm going to do something that I don't think I've ever done before, which is actually advertise myself. I've ceased to be humble for a reason that I can't quite put my fingers on, unless it's something to do with retirement. But at least you will recognize that book on the bookshelf at the back. And I put it up simply because, though that book was published in 1991, there is one sentence from it that has been quoted many, many times. It was almost an afterthought when I wrote it, but it's somehow come to epitomize the message of that book. And it goes something like this: there is no such thing as the relation between science and religion. It is what many individuals and communities have made of it in a plethora of different contexts. And I think I still stand by that. Let's be wary of people who can tell us what the correct relationship between science and religion ought to be. Because I think one thing we do learn from history is that it's very difficult to construct a normative account. Here's just one little historical vignette. In my university over in Oxford, there was a theologian of the late 19th century, Aubrey Moore, who, when he reflected on evolutionary theory, famously wrote that under the guise of a foe, Darwin had done the work of a friend. Now, that's a very interesting remark, and it immediately presents us with a more nuanced picture. Darwin, still seen today, of course, as an enemy in some religious constituencies, had done the work of a friend, according to Moore, had done the work of a friend by liberating Christianity from belief in the wrong kind of God. The wrong kind of God was a kind of magician who intervened like a deus ex machina to create new species out of nothing. But that God, Moore insisted, was not the God of Christianity. So Darwin does Christianity a service on that theological view by eliminating the image of God the magician. For Aubrey Moore, a creative process of evolution was consonant with Christian theology, and a theology in which God worked through nature, not by intervening from outside. And that subtlety of More's remark stands, I think, as a warning against simplistic models of how science and religion should be related. Well, does history suggest that science and religion might have features in common? And that's the question I'd just like to ponder for a moment. Because one way of breaking down a rigid division might be to show that science and religion have more in common than images of conflict suggest. I should say this is not the main path I want to follow in this talk. And I say that because scientists and religious believers are usually engaged in very different kinds of exercise. Prayer, meditation, worship, these contrast with the testing of hypotheses through controlled experimentation. But I think it's worth noting that there is not a complete contrast. For the theologian Thomas Chalmers, who led the disruption of the Scottish Church in 1843, science and religion had things in common. And Chalmers put it like this: both science and religion are refined abstractions from the grossness of the familiar and ordinary world. In his view, and I quote, there is a very close affinity between a taste for science and a taste for sacredness. And the similarity consists in this, he writes: they make man a more reflective and less sensual being than before. Both science and religion take one away from simple, seductive sensuality. Now that's an old example, taken from the 19th century. So here's another source of similarity, recently disclosed by the editor-in-chief of the journal Science. Science, as you know, is the organ of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And that journal was celebrating its 125th anniversary in 2005. And it chose to do so by posing 125 questions, rather, one has to add, than giving 125 answers. That actually is the point, because as Donald Kennedy explained in his editorial, my love of science has much to do with its mystery. Research, he says, may be about answers, but science is about questions. I find it rather attractive that perceptive admission that science is as much about the lure of the mysterious as it is about the elimination of the mysterious. So if one were looking for further similarities, I think we might turn to Einstein, very familiar face, of course, but who on one occasion said something that I found very arresting when I first encountered him. Einstein says on one occasion, the emotional state which enables great scientific achievements to be made is similar to that of the religious person or the person in love. Very interesting remark. So some science and some religion may then have elements in common. As Hermann Bondi said of Einstein, he was quite convinced that beauty was a guiding principle in the search for important results in theoretical physics. That sense of beauty has often been linked, certainly historically, to belief in a God who designed a beautiful universe, albeit a flawed one. Now, to identify common elements is not the only way of breaking down some of the barriers. It's obvious, I think, that there have been eminent scientists who have had strong religious leanings. And this points, I think, to another way in which the rigidity of the categories might be challenged. So I'd just like to say something now about the interpenetration of science and religion, the interpenetration. To a historian of science, it would, I think, be obvious that science and religion have not always been enemies. Scientific thinkers may not always have been the most orthodox in their religious beliefs, but among the pioneers of modern science, there was often a fusion of scientific and theological interest. And I stress that word fusion, not a separation, but a fusion of scientific and theological interest. Newton is one of the most striking examples of this. Newton famously remarked that the task of the natural philosopher is to deduce causes from their effects until we arrive at the first cause, which is certainly not mechanical. For Newton, and he was quite explicit about this, it's part of the business of natural philosophy to discuss divine attributes and God's relationship to the world of nature. Science, if you like, included theological discourse at the end of the 17th century. And one consequence was that theological doctrines were redefined in scientific terms. So space, for example, is understood by Newton to be constituted by divine omnipresence, which was a very different view philosophically from that of Descartes or Leibniz. You put very simply what Newton is saying: without God, there would be no space. Whereas Descartes had said, without matter, there would be no space. And there's a very big difference between those two views. So Newton nicely shows, I think, how history can complicate the picture. By some of his contemporaries, his science was emphatically seen as friendly to religion. Here in Cambridge, Newton's successor to the Lucasian chair of mathematics was one William Whiston, rather dangerous heretic, who shouted his anti-Trinitarian views from the rooftops and therefore was deprived of his Cambridge post, and he then had to eke out a rather meagre existence. I was going to say lecturing in nightclubs in London. I should have said coffee houses. William Whiston is a very good example of somebody who took Newton's science to be theologically deeply significant. The force of gravity, which we associate with Newton, is after all an invisible force. Newton never could explain how it actually worked. He could describe its action mathematically, but what the mechanism for gravity was, Newton could never explain. It's an invisible force. And for Whiston, this was exciting, because it showed again that Descartes' mechanistic philosophy, which had begun to reign supreme in France in particular, Descartes' philosophy was limited. Newton and God have actually got quite a lot in common. Perhaps I could just remind you of some of the sort of mathematical diagrams you find in the Principia. This is Newton working out how one might explain the elliptical orbits of planets with reference to the inverse square law. Put very simply, and Newton put it very simply, the beauty of the solar system argues a deity very well skilled in mechanics and geometry. Or put it another way, God was no less brilliant than Newton himself. For Newton, the unity of nature reflects the unity of the divine mind. And that's very significant philosophically, because it provides one of the guarantees that the same laws operate throughout the universe. And I just like to underline that particular connection between science, religion and metaphysics. Concepts of the unity of nature linked to the unity of the Godhead and to the unity of scientific knowledge have featured very prominently in the history of Western culture. And in saying that, I recognize that within Islam also ideas of unity are extremely important. So, religion could gain from Newton's science. So it seemed to Whiston, and I think for Newton himself. But at the same time, and this is where we get the other side of the coin, Newton was suspected of heresy. His science was associated with a denial of the doctrine of the Trinity, which of course was a great problem for Christians. High church Anglicans in the 18th century were sometimes very severe critics of Newton's science. And the point is this: the answer to the question whether science and religion are friends or enemies is that it can depend on where you are coming from. There is no simple answer. My main point here is that the coexistence and interpenetration of theistic and scientific concepts in the mind of a figure as celebrated as Newton must, I think, dissolve the rigid divisions that structure popular debate. Put yet another way, to ask how Newton reconciled his science with his religion is simply the wrong question. It assumes a conflict when, in Newton's own view, there certainly wasn't one. Now, historical examples can be suggestive in other ways. They break down the sharp divisions by revealing what I'm going to call the possibility of mediating or middle positions. So, a few words now on what can go, as it were, between those two terms, science and religion. When discussing revolutions in scientific thought that have changed our place in the universe, I think we're apt to contrast the new with the old in black and white terms, missing the subtlety of middle positions. And participants in scientific controversies have sometimes done the same. This is your starter for 20. Who can identify that personally? Galileo, exactly, yes. When Galileo constructed his famous dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which was published in 1632 and precipitated his famous trial, he actually found it convenient to neglect what was a third chief world system. Because if there were only two, the pre-Copernican and the Copernican, and he could show that the Earth-centered system was false, then of course that very nicely demonstrated the truth of the Copernican system. But if you've got a third chief world system, that actually gets in the way. And I'm going to suggest in a moment that Galileo himself failed to recognize the value and the potency of that middle position. So let's just do the visuals here. That's an image, not wonderfully clear, I'm afraid, but quite a colourful one of the pre-Copernican universe. The Earth is at the centre. There are various spheres of the four elements encircling the Earth. As we move outwards, we come to the moon, of course, and then the planets going out, till eventually one comes to the spheres of the stars. That's what we mean by the geocentric system, or as C.S. Lewis famously described it as the diabolocentric view of the universe, because at the centre of the Earth was hell. I mean, one should say that the Earth wasn't necessarily a great place to be, even though it was at the centre, because everything kept falling onto you at the centre. It's the kind of garbage bin of the universe. And there is a sense in which, contrary to popular belief, a sense in which the Copernican system actually elevated humanity and placed the Earth up among the planets, which was in the Aristotelian superlunary sphere, where everything was much more pleasant. Now, just a reminder of the simplicity of the Copernican system. You've got the sun now, Sol, at the centre, and the various planets radiating outwards. Well, those are the two chief world systems that Galileo played off against each other in 1632. What he failed to mention was the third world system that had been proposed by Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer. This is a very ingenious system, actually. Let me see if I can make this do the trick. Because what you have is the Earth still stationary here in the universe, but we have, now actually I've got the wrong one there, let's get this right. Here we have the Earth stationary at the centre, and here we have the Sun orbiting the Earth, just as in the traditional cosmology. But notice that all the other planets are actually in orbit round the Sun, not around the Earth. Mathematically, that system is equivalent to the Copernican system, but theologically it has the wonderful advantage that you can keep the Earth static, thereby, as it were, protecting those verses of Scripture which seemed to imply a stationary Earth. So this is called the geo-heliocentric system. It was quite popular with the Jesuits during the 1620s and 1630s. It just simply shows that the situation is more complicated, but in a very engaging and very interesting way. Middle positions, I think, have usually been possible in scientific controversies, where religious interests have also been at stake. And I was reading just this morning, actually, as I was coming here, an essay by David Lindbergh, a very fine science historian from the University of Wisconsin in the States. And he wanted to put forward as a very general notion that where there have been these divisive issues in the past, like the Copernican system, for the most part, the scientists and the religious thinkers have sought a kind of accommodation or a compromise. The notion of a kind of all-out warfare as the relationship that characterizes the history of science and religion, he thinks is really up the spout, and I have to say that I agree with him. Now, you could protest, and you'd be right to do so, that this may not be such a great example, because the Tychonic system, of course, did eventually disappear. We don't actually support that view now, and the Copernican system did eventually triumph. But the middle positions are not always so vulnerable. In 19th century debates over evolution, for example, there were distinguished scientific figures who construed the development of a new species as a kind of continuous creation in which there was an unfolding of a divine plan. And I'd just like to introduce you for a moment to one of the great anatomists and paleontologists of the 19th century. This is Richard Owen. I always like to talk about because he was a native of Lancaster, which is where I've spent most of my life. It's actually Owen, and you may not know this, who coined the word dinosaur. So whenever I see the word dinosaur, I feel Lancaster is somehow implicated. Here's Owen riding to fame on the back of a megatherium. He's an interesting figure because he rose to a position of considerable political power during Darwin's early life. And one little indication of that is a famous repast, a famous meal held in the grounds of the Crystal Palace early in the 1850s, when there was an exhibition in which Owen designed the dinosaurs. Now, the design doesn't look quite as we're used to seeing dinosaurs today, but this strange beast here was one of Owen's reconstructions, and they held the final banquet inside the dinosaur that Owen had reconstructed, and there he is presiding over the dinner. I can never resist showing that because, to my knowledge, it's the first example of a dinosaur diner. The really important reason for talking about Richard Owen, however, is not that, but this. It's a diagram from one of his famous texts. in which he argues that all the vertebrates are modelled on a kind of archetypal, oh, sorry, wrong one. Let's just go back and we'll get the red spot again. This is the kind of archetypal structure on which many other vertebrates are based. And Owen could argue that that archetype was in reality and originally an idea in the mind of God. And I call this a middle position, and I think it's quite a nice example of what. Because Owen did not deny that secondary causes were instrumental in this unfolding process of evolution. But at the same time, Owen argues that these causes are under divine control. The history of life on Earth is the unfolding of a plan. It's a process of constant creation. And so Owen was one of Darwin's severest critics, yet at the same time claimed that he had originated evolutionary theory. So he's a very interesting figure. And as you see, there is direct theistic reference in that kind of Platonism. Now, many variants of theistic evolution flourished in late 19th century and in early 20th century Europe and America. And that fact is very important because it meant that Christians and Jews were not in the position of having to choose directly between natural selection on the one hand and miraculous intervention on the other. There's almost a sense in which the polarities typified today by Richard Dawkins on the one hand and intelligent design theorists on the other, that's a much more trenchant polarity, in my mind, than actually existed in the immediate post-Darwinian period and for much of the first half of the 20th century. And there are, of course, modern examples as well in the context of evolutionary theory. One can be a Darwinian and still point to constraints in the evolutionary process that have led to convergent trends, such as the independent reappearance of the same basic structures, the same kind of eye, for example. And here in Cambridge, Simon Conway Morris, who's Professor of Paleontology and who I know has spoken at events the Faraday Institute has organised in the past and will do so again. Simon has a book called Life's Solution, which I saw at the back earlier in the day. And the last chapter of that book is particularly interesting because it lists a series of criteria that he feels enabled him to say that an evolving universe may also be seen as a work of creation. It's a mediating position. It's not an either or. Now, some of you will have noticed that so far I've been speaking in a very simple way about the relations between something I've called science and something we call religion. But at this point, I just want to point out how unsatisfactory that is, because that kind of talk assumes that there is a thing called science, of which we can specify the essence, and a thing called religion, of which the essence can also be distilled. What I want to suggest, and I think the history makes it inevitable, I want to suggest that we should speak about sciences and religions, not about science and religion. And when we begin to speak about sciences and religions, the traditional divisions again lose their rigidity. So a few words now about the plural, why one must put an S on the end of those two words. Now, this handsome man, whom I produced prematurely, was one of Cambridge's great illuminati of the 19th century. This is the man who invented the word scientist. You've already had the inventor of dinosaurs. Whewell actually invented scientists. The word had not been used until the 1830s in England. He was master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and arguably was the first major historian and philosopher of science. And I've introduced him because Whewell, in his philosophy of science, has a very interesting thesis, which is that there are many different sciences, plural, each shaped by its own distinctive methods and what he called their distinctive fundamental ideas. Now, this is a crucial insight for our purposes, because we can say at given points in time, one science might be posing a challenge to a particular religion, when another science might actually be offering support. So once again, we find the situation much more interesting. Here's an example. During the 17th century, and following the observations of Galileo, telescopic discoveries posed a problem for theological discussion. Now, the most famous image from Galileo's telescopic observation is, of course, the moon. And in his view, images like that demonstrated that the moon was not a perfect sphere. It was actually rough, and he deduced from the patterns of light and shade that the moon had mountains and craters. That was a challenge at the time to the Aristotelian thesis that heavenly bodies were actually smooth and impeccable. I just want to point to this crater here. There's a bit of rhetoric going on there because it's a bit larger in the image than it would be in real life. That particular circle persuaded Kepler, and I think Galileo possibly too, that this might be evidence of life on the moon. There's an analogy in the roughness of the Earth's surface with Bohemia, what we would later call Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. Galileo was warned by one of his friends, if he insisted on making analogies between earthly countries and the moon, somebody would ask the question, how did the descendants of Adam and Eve manage to get to the moon? And that was a tricky question in the 1820s. So there's another kind of theological rumble here about possible life on other worlds and all the ramifications of that. But that's not what I want to talk about in this context. There was another observation Galileo made, which I think in the long run was probably more serious, because he revealed through the telescope countless stars that are invisible to the naked eye. And it posed a very significant question for any natural theologian. What is the purpose for humankind of stars that you can't see? Because we don't wander around the streets of Cambridge with a telescope stuck to our eyes. Now, that problem actually remained in the background for 2 or 3 centuries. Some would say it's still with us today, though the stars actually do things now that we didn't know they did then. But the point I really want to make is that that great English novelist, Thomas Hardy, in the 19th century, in one of his early novels called Two on a Tower, exploited that telescopic observation to argue that not only were these invisible stars not made for man, and forgive the gendered language, but that's the language he used, not only are these stars not made for man, therefore nothing was. Nothing. It's a very, well, it's a non sequitur, one might say, but of course you can see what he's driving. Psychologically, the threat from this deeply expanded universe could make it seem rather naive that there is a God up there who takes an interest in puny humankind. So, the science of the telescope in the 17th century could be creating difficulties for theological reflection. Whereas at exactly the same time, the science of the microscope was actually opening up a magnificent new world, of extraordinarily filigree structures, which enabled naturalists to point to the wisdom and intelligence of a divine designer. The minutest insect seemed to have a wonderfully intricate structure. Now, this may not be the kind of thing you want to meet on a dark night, but it's simply the eye of a fly. And when you see the eye of a fly magnified, as it was in Robert Hooke's Micrographia, you see a very complex but also very, very engaging and beautiful structure. There's something almost atomistic about the way it all fits together to make a larger whole. Now, not only flies, but also fleas. Even the proboscis of a flea was thought to be very finely wrought and could evoke a sense of wonder that the divine artificer, the divine architect, could have made creatures as tiny as this, but on such an extraordinary kind of scale. Now, you might possibly protest that a world in which one was not bitten by fleas might be preferable to a world in which there are fleas. But that actually prompted the rather engaging reflection that fleas provided a cheap form of bloodletting for the poor. Well, that was one suggestion. What I'm suggesting here is that through microscopy there was a new kind of natural theology which drew attention to, as it were, the finer filigree parts of creation that could only be understood in the context of a God who had very carefully manipulated their structures. So I've been talking there about a plurality of sciences, and you might feel what we ought to acknowledge here is, despite the plurality, scientific communities in their interface with the public have tried to describe a formal procedure which is usually called the scientific method, as if there is only one. Now, there's a very sophisticated literature, I have to say, on the rhetoric and the politics of that discourse of scientific method. And I think one has to say that scientists do not always conform to their own idealizations. And I say that with complete impunity, because many have actually confessed it themselves. In other words, there's a kind of formal way in which you discuss scientific method, but it's not usually the method by which great discoveries are made. History shows us not only the existence of a plurality of sciences, but it also shows us, I think, that representatives of the sciences have sometimes reached diametrically opposite metaphysical conclusions on the basis of their respective methods. So even adopting the same method, you sometimes get results which seem to point in entirely opposite directions, at least as far as the participants in a controversy might argue. For example, during the second half of the 19th century, physicists and geologists fell out, reaching contrary conclusions on the age of the Earth. I was going to say they started beating each other over the head, but that gives a kind of image of the geological hammer, which is perhaps overdoing it a bit. The question of the age of the Earth was not a trivial matter when the mechanism of evolutionary transformation was at issue. So two sciences could actually generate quite different conclusions. Similarly, in the early years of the 20th century, astronomy and biology fell out on the subject of extraterrestrial life. And this is an example which I've always found very intriguing. Just as today, the astronomers of the early 20th century gleefully did their probability calculations concerning the likely number of planets at the same distance from other suns as we are from ours, and therefore, of course, one did probability calculation as to how many were likely to be inhabited. But the intriguing thing is the biologists would not have it. And the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, in fact used Darwin's theory to contest the conclusions of the astronomers. It's a very ingenious argument, rather like Stephen Jay Gould, 50, actually one almost should say 100 years later. Rather like Stephen Jay Gould, Wallace stressed the accidents, the contingencies, the divergences in the evolutionary process. And therefore his argument was, even if you had the same physico-chemical conditions on another planet, somewhere else in the universe, the possibility of life comparable to human beings developing in a similar trajectory to the way in which we've evolved on Earth, the chances are minuscule, however great the probability might be in the calculations of the astronomers. So I'm just drawing attention again there to a sort of tension between two different scientific paradigms. Controversy within the sciences is something that's often overlooked in discussions about science and religion. Or rather than multiply examples or labour the point, can I just switch now for a moment to the other plurality? Religions rather than religion. Even within one and the same religion, there can be very different responses to the sciences. There is, for example, an extensive literature on the role of Christian dissenters in promoting a culture of science and technology in 17th and 18th century England. Puritan values have been seen as more conducive to scientific activity than the more contemplative Roman Catholic spiritualities. But it's also clear that the different world faiths have had their own distinctive attitudes towards scientific culture, and that renders any single treatment immediately suspect. It's often said, for example, that certain Hindu traditions have been more amenable to ecological sensitivity and even to evolutionary perspectives than the classical theism of mainstream Christianity. Indeed, Christianity has sometimes been blamed for actually accelerating our environmental crises. I'm not going to go into that. I think the argument is very much overstated, but it does indicate that one has to be alive to the way in which different religious traditions can interact with the sciences in different ways. The late Joseph Needham, and there's an institute here in Cambridge which honours his great legacy, Joseph Needham, the sinologist, who wrote perhaps more than anybody has written on the quality of ancient science in China. Needham argued, very, very interesting, that the absence of the idea of a personal God, a God who had legislated for the world that God had created, the absence of that kind of God might partly explain the absence in China of the abstract and mathematically expressed laws of nature that have featured so prominently in the physical sciences of the Christian West. Notice playing off there in a very interesting way, one culture against another. Now, for all his great love and empathy with Chinese science, some critics have pointed out that Needham is a bit chauvinistic when he writes in that way. There's still a presupposition that Western physical science has the edge over traditional Chinese science, and that this has something to do with the way in which in the West, in Alexandre Poiret's famous words, we were able to explain the real by the impossible. And that's a rather succinct and philosophically very interesting way of saying what scientists actually do. which is to explain the real by the impossible, abstracting the ideal mathematical model to which you then relate the real phenomena of the material world. That's the method of Galileo, it's the method of Newton, and it's been the method of most physical sciences ever since. Now, these differences between religious cultures have often been magnified for all kinds of apologetic reasons, and we must be on our guard. But the very fact that they exist at all means we cannot simply say whether science, in some general sense, is either a friend or an enemy to religion. As my colleague Geoffrey Cantor has remarked, when we are asked about the relations between science and religion, the first response must be, whose science and whose religion? Do scientific theories have simple and necessary consequences for religious belief? Do scientific theories entail metaphysical or theological conclusions? Many popular writers on science seem to assume that they do. I think that even if there were only one science and only one religion, that would still be an indefensible view. This is because one and the same science can simultaneously both underpin and undermine a religious perspective. At one and the same time, the same science can do that. This is manifestly true of geology in the decades preceding Darwin's Origin of Species. If we'd been here in Cambridge in the 1830s, I think we would have been sure to meet one of Darwin's teachers. This is Adam Sedgwick, who taught geology in this university. Because of his name, Adam, he was known to his friends as the first of men. Sedgwick makes a very interesting point, using the fossil record to argue against the atheist. This is geology coming to the aid of theology at the time. It's a very interesting argument. Sedgwick says if you look at the fossil record, you see new species appearing in certain strata which were evidently not there before. I have a kind of schematic demonstration of this. It's not a very good slide, but I think the key point here is that if you imagine discrete geological epochs separated by whatever kind of catastrophe might have supervened, as you go through the history of life, you see new species appearing which would not have been in this epoch and not in this. Species which were once not there appear. Sedgwick says this clearly defeats the atheist, who traditionally had argued that all living things were of an eternal form. We don't need a creator if all living things were actually eternal. Sedgwick is saying, behold, geology, the science of geology, is showing us that living species are not eternal forms, and therefore that Aristotelian kind of atheism is undermined by the science of geology. But notice, at the same time, these species which were in a particular epoch do not appear later, they have become extinct. So the very same phenomenon raises a theological difficulty, which is why should a caring God allow his creatures to perish? It's a disturbing and a rather melancholy consequence of the fossil record, as Tennyson expressed beautifully, very poignantly, in his poem In Memoriam. This, I think, means we have to be very careful when speaking of what scientific discoveries entail for religious belief. And as I said a moment ago, in the literature of popular science, there's a tendency to make the science more portentous in its implications than a more sober estimate would allow. Just putting it rather mischievously, to claim that a new scientific discovery has major implications for religious belief is a well-tried way of catching public attention. In his study of the secularization of the European mind in the 19th century, the very distinguished Cambridge ecclesiastical historian Owen Chadwick made the very shrewd observation that a public not especially interested in science, a public not necessarily especially interested in religion, for that matter, might be very interested indeed in science versus religion. Many modern journalists clearly agree, or they act as if they do. But the idea that scientific data or even scientific theories entail certain consequences for metaphysical or theological positions seems to me greatly overstated. We might even suggest that scientific knowledge is neutral with respect to belief in God. And I say that because it can usually be consonant either with theism or with atheism. Whatever the science may tell you about the nature and structure of the world, it's difficult to see how that knowledge could be incompatible with the affirmation of some kind of creator. I say some kind of because the doctrine of creation itself needs a kind of articulation which may have to be very sophisticated. I just want to say that this is not actually a very radical observation. Even Darwin's disciple, Huxley, whom we met earlier, even Huxley admitted that Darwin's theory has no more to do with theism, I'm quoting here, has no more to do with theism than had the first book of Euclid. So what he means by that is that Darwin's theory simply does not touch the question of whether behind the universe there is some kind of transcendent power. Now, of course, there's opposition between a literal reading of Genesis and our modern understanding of cosmology and evolution. And for many, I know, that is not a trivial matter. And it's not a trivial matter for those within other religions who give reverence to a sacred text. But I do strenuously urge that we should not fall prey to the extremists, either among the religious or among the scientists, who so clearly feed off each other in this kind of context. The tendency for evolutionary science to become a kind of evolutionist religion has been conceded even by scholars who themselves have strong naturalistic preferences. I'm thinking particularly there of the American philosopher of biology Michael Ruse, who I think does try very hard to be dispassionate about this particular issue. So I've been saying that a science could be appropriated at one and the same time, both by the friends of religion and by its enemies. And history can also be helpful, I think, if we switch our gaze, and we're coming near to the end now, if we switch our gaze from time to space. Because some of the finest work in the sphere of science and religion has actually been done by scholars who are sensitive to the effect of local events and circumstances on the reception of new scientific ideas. So I have a little section here which I like to call the place of places. The importance of where you are and events taking place in that context. when it comes to appraising new ideas? Well, here we are, of course, in Westminster College. And I already indicated earlier, this is deeply nostalgic for me, because I've been along the photographs in the corridor, right back to the years when I was here. And I've been pondering all afternoon what has happened to those handsome faces that were contemporary with my own. Actually, my face isn't there, so I'm making no claim about my own physiognomy. But suppose we ask this question. How did Presbyterians respond to Darwin's theory of evolution in the years or so following its publication? I say Presbyterianism because this college used to be, when I was here, the College of the Presbyterian Church of England, a theological tradition in which Calvinist doctrines were often very prominent. The answer to the question, how did Presbyterians respond to Darwin's theory of evolution, is, it all depends on where you were. If you were in Belfast in 1874, you might have heard the physicist John Tyndall deliver his presidential address before the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, Tyndall was deeply annoyed by the neglect of the sciences in some of the Irish Christian colleges. So Tyndall goes on to the offensive, declaring that the scientific world would claim and take from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory. It's a kind of Peter Atkins or Richard Dawkins of the 1870s. And in a historical survey designed to show the triumph of science over superstition, Tyndall associated Darwin's theory with his own secular materialist beliefs, thereby, and this is the point, alienating a religious constituency that would henceforward regard Darwinism and materialism as virtually synonymous. But if we'd been in Princeton in the 1870s, by contrast, despite the fact that Charles Hodge rejected Darwinism as atheistic, Presbyterians were, for the most part, much less troubled by the Darwinian theory. In Scotland, it's a different story again. Presbyterian voices were initially concerned. But according to David Livingstone, he's a very fine historian and historical geographer at Queen's University, Belfast, according to the research of David Livingstone, the Darwinian theory was far less a worry, this is in Scotland, than was the radical biblical criticism of a figure like Robertson Smith. So the important lesson is this: whether a particular piece of science is perceived as a friend or enemy may crucially depend on local events and circumstances. And that lesson, I think, is no less relevant today. Discussions of the kind, is creation science really science, or is it religion? That question features in American courts of law in a way that we have really not faced in this country. Is the appeal to intelligent design an appeal to science, or is it really religion? That either-or choice is rearing its head again. Very prevalent in North American contexts, where I'm sure it has something to do with the protection of a constitution, very different from ours in the UK. But I would want to say, and this is really my next observation, that that choice, that either-or choice, is it science or is it religion, is itself deeply restrictive. When testing legalities, the teaching of ideas about creation or design is perceived to be either the teaching of science or the teaching of religion. That's what the court case always seems to be about. No other option seems to be possible. But surely this is impossible to countenance. Is it really correct to project this image of simply a kind of two-horse race between science and religion? it's surely a false division. And I believe it would be a move in the right direction if young people were helped to see that discourse about creation and/or discourse about design, in a very crucial sense, belong neither to science nor to religion in any straightforward way. This is a discourse that belongs to the study of metaphysics. It belongs to the study of the philosophy of religion. It belongs to the study of the philosophy of science also. It's not just science and religion juxtaposed. We need the help of other disciplines. And too often, it seems to me, we refer to the dialogue between science and religion as if there were only two parties. Conversations between scientists and theologians are set up as if the immediate juxtaposition might produce original insight, sudden illumination, a way of living together. My view would be that without the mediation of the humanities and the social sciences, the conclusions drawn from many of those conversations have been extremely naive. I've tried to show in this talk how historical study can be instructive. But the mediation of metaphysics, the mediation of philosophy, these are also fundamental. Having said that, the assumption that there are only two discourses worth talking about has found expression in many modern discussions of science and religion. And the example with which I would just like to conclude is that of Stephen Jay Gould in his little book Rocks of Ages that he composed towards the end of his life. In that book, Steve Gould at least allows both science and religion to survive, which is more than can be said for Richard Dawkins. Gould enables them both to survive as long as one accepts a principle which was clearly very dear to his heart, a principle he called NOMA, N-O-M-A, which is an acronym for the fact that there should be no overlapping magisteria. The sphere of authority of science and the sphere of authority of religion should not be allowed to overlap. If and when they do, it's being disastrous. That's basically Gould's line. The province of the authority of science, in his view, is the determination of facts about the world. Notice that, because in some ways it's a very limited view of what science does. But anyway, that's what he says. The province of one is the determination of facts about the world. The proper province of the other, that's religion, is the determination of moral values. And if you accept that partition, then science and religion can live happily together. Now, of course, it's a very neat partition, and as Gould recognised, very far from original. The trouble is, history, I think, shows that it doesn't really work. It reduces, I've already hinted, reduces the dignity and ambition of the sciences, which are not concerned simply to identify facts. And it also has the effect of reducing religion to nothing but personal morality. It's a reductive formula on both accounts. And it seems to me that at least two reasons why a richer repertoire of resources really is required. If there are only two players, science and religion, defined as Gould defines them, how is a dispute to be resolved when competing claims do arise, as we know as a social fact that they do? Secondly, and I find this rather more interesting, the NOMA principle may be an ideal, but it's not one to which Gould himself was able to stick. He was involved in a rather bitter controversy with Simon Conway Morris, whom I mentioned earlier. particularly over the interpretation of the Burgess Shale, which contains some of the very earliest fossils reflecting the earliest life on Earth. What I found interesting about their controversy was that each side accused the other of allowing their religious beliefs to influence their interpretation of the fossil record. Simon challenged Steve by saying that your kind of Marxist atheistic ideas are leading you to interpret the fossil record in a way which emphasizes accident, contingency, lack of purpose, lack of direction. Most of those earliest living forms actually perished without leaving any kind of succession. Gould, for his part, hints that Simon's own view, in which there are these convergent trends in evolution, might that not actually be influenced by a religious presupposition of some kind? It's interesting because religion's not supposed to intrude into modern science, and yet here we have a very, very recent controversy where each side accuses the other of actually betraying, as it were, true scientific principle. And yet it's not quite like that, because what really interested me was what Gould says in their dispute. There's one point where Gould says, my science has necessarily been shaped by my personal beliefs and preferences. It's a very, very interesting concession. My science has been necessarily shaped by personal beliefs and preferences. And that leads me really to the question that I want to put to you, because I've been saying all evening in this rather long talk that we must be suspicious of just putting together those two words, science and religion, because all kinds of baggage, and unacceptable baggage, is often carried along with them. Might we perhaps make a bit of progress if we were to say that much of the controversy that has arisen in the past still pervades the discourse today is a controversy over worldviews, not just about science and its implications, not just about religious beliefs and their possible implications, but that there are deep convictions held by people, and those convictions colour their whole framework in which they interpret other events, other forms of knowledge. So I'm going to sign off at that point, but just to be a little bit more positive, can I say that I do actually believe there have been spiritually organised worldviews in the past that have allowed the sciences to prosper. The notion that religion is always the stumbling block to science is not, I think, a defensible position. And what you have on the screen there now comes from a classic text of natural theology. This is a little sort of pastiche of illustrations from an edition of William Paley's Natural Theology. This is a book that was published in 1802 and is always discussed by the philosophers and by writers on science and religion when the argument for design is brought into the discussion. Paley's treatment is actually a very simple one, but it's very beguiling in its way. What he wants to argue is that there are anatomical features of the webbed, the webbed feet of aquatic birds, for example, enables them to swim. The beaks of particular birds seem designed for the particular environment in which they manage to survive. We've got the beak of the woodpecker, which enables it to get tiny insects out of the bark of trees. We've got the hump on the back of the camel that enables it to store water. These all seem to Paley to be examples of contrivance. And Paley's famous argument for design is that where you have contrivance, there must be a contriver with a capital C. Paley's emphasis on adaptation on the way in which living things seem well adapted to the particular environments in which they flourish. That argument defined for many years a kind of research program in biogeography, because one could be stimulated to study the natural history of many parts of the globe, seeking to study this phenomenon of adaptation. And it's within a framework where the discovery of adaptation points to the divine watchmaker. It's one of the great ironies in the history of science that a lot of the wonderful scientific research done under the paradigm of natural theology eventually led to a theory that undermined the way Paley formulated his argument. And I'm thinking, of course, of the way Darwin's theory of natural selection does undermine that argument from contrivance to contrivance. Contrivance to contriver. I want to stop there because in the second of my lectures tomorrow morning, I'm going to leave this very general discussion of this evening, and I want to focus much more specifically on the life and spiritual odyssey of Darwin himself, to try to show that once again the history can be very constructive. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, very much indeed for getting us off to a great start. And that was just a wonderful overview. I can see the first thing we'll have to do is change the name of the Faraday Institute for Sciences and Religion. So that's the first thing we'll have to do in response to this particular talk. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussion.
So some of the stuff I've read particularly about the 19th century debates has implied that actually the real issue or the real debate going on was about power and authority, that traditionally the church were the people who had the sort of authority in talking about these things, and Thomas Huxley and the others wanted science to be in the lead. How much do you think that really was what was going on, and that they used this sort of the myth of the conflict in order to promote that? Because that's what I've read, and I wondered if that was really the case, basically.
You've been reading the right things. Yes, I've absolutely no quarrel with that, and of course it in a sense illustrates one of my points, that you do need to go into the social and political context and not just talk about science and religion as abstract ideas. There is a power game going on, yes. There's very, very interesting statistical evidence on the presence of the clergy within scientific societies and academies. During the first half of the 19th century, you can still find quite a strong presence, particularly of Anglican clergymen, within, for example, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, even within the Royal Society. If you look at the period from 1850 to 1900, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify a single clergyman who is actually involved in serious scientific work. So there's a very, very interesting social transformation of science itself from a kind of amateur pursuit, the amateur pursuit of the country clergyman who collects his beetles, wants to talk about the wonderful work of the Creator. And on the other hand, the sort of emerging professional standards of somebody like Charles Lyell in geology, Huxley himself, of course, who was a very gifted naturalist, men like Richard Owen, whom I referred to earlier. These are people who are actually dedicating themselves full time to scientific research, whereas the clergyman has, after all, another call on his time. And Lyell makes the very pertinent point, that if, like Adam Sedgwick, you're a canon of Norwich Cathedral and at the same time reader or professor of geology here in Cambridge University, you have perforce got split loyalties. Not necessarily cognitively, but in terms of how much time you give to each. And Lyell simply says in the 1830s, if you want to be a geologist, it's no good doing it part-time. It's got to be a serious, concentrated, specialist activity. Now, interestingly, and Jim Moore, who works here in Cambridge, has made this point very, very well. It's actually in an article in the Lindbergh and Numbers book, again at the back, called God and Nature. Jim Moore points out that just as there was a professionalization of the sciences, used, if you like, in part to marginalize the clergy, so the academic study of theology becomes a specialist academic enterprise during the latter years of the 19th century. And one consequence of that is that religious discourse and scientific discourse begin to move further apart than they had done within the tradition of natural theology and that work of Paley that I showed at the end. Because theologians, in order to emphasize their sophistication, would distance themselves from the rather naive kind of natural theology which they saw still being practiced by some scientists. And scientists like Huxley, particularly if they were anti-clerical, would use their science, and Darwinian science especially, perhaps, to show just what it meant to be a serious scientist in the modern world. If it took Darwin 20 years to write The Origin of Species, a clergyman who captures a few toads in the village pond is not actually going to seriously challenge that quality of scientific work. Sorry, that was an awful lot of words just to say that you were right.
Just to add to that, also, of course, that our associate director, who's sitting here on the front row, Bob White, is the current professor of geophysics here in Cambridge, and I'm sure would agree that to be a full-time canon and to run also a full-time lab would have been extremely challenging things. Are you actually, is your chair Sedgwick's chair?
No, it's not actually Sedgwick's
It's
chair.
not actually
because
Sedgwick's
they didn't have
chair,
geophysics in that day.
Okay, so okay, there's a question over here. Yes.
I've got two questions really. Shall I fire the both of you? And,
That depends what the first one's like.
Well, the first one is what you made a rather powerful attack on the science as being not objective, as it is perceived to be. And I felt a bit that it was based quite often more on anecdotal evidence of scientists falling out and the way they were arguing with each other, rather than on having it been shown on some in some methodology. But at one point you referred to that the scientific method is not usually the one by which discoveries are being made.
I didn't say usually not.
Yes,
I said
I thought that was going really more to the core. I wondered whether you can give some examples of that to get a bit deeper into that.
Yes, I mean, if you are really interested in that question, there was an excellent book published a few years ago in Australia, actually, edited by Richard Yeo and John Schuster. And it's called The Politics and Rhetoric of Scientific Method. And it explains in a very, very interesting way how scientists often appeal to a rigorous scientific method, the discourse of method, after they have actually already produced whatever kind of scientific results they wish to communicate to the public. The classic example of this would be back in the 17th century. Descartes wrote a little discourse on method. And any student studying philosophy, I think, will have read either Descartes' discourse on method or his meditation. And there was a time when people reading that discourse actually took it literally. I mean, they thought this is how Descartes had actually made his discovery in optics, or his discoveries in meteorology, or his discoveries in geometry. But from really deep and sophisticated historical research, we know that what Descartes actually did when he was making these discoveries was something very, very different from the formal presentation of a kind of schematized systematic method that he wants to present to the general public. That would be one rather famous example of the disparity between claims that this is the method of science and the actual method that has been used to elicit the results. The most radical position on this was taken by the philosopher Paul Feyerabend in a book entitled Against Method, where he famously finished up with the rather anarchic statement that in science anything goes. Anything goes. Meaning any method which actually delivers results that can be used and become part of a fertile research program can be defended. They have their warrant in that. So I think it's generally agreed Feyerabend went a little bit off the map by concluding in that very anarchic way. But he showed with some very interesting case studies that there have been many scientists claiming to be adhering to a specific method, when one can see from their lab notebooks or whatever that the pattern of discovery was actually very different from the pattern of justification. And that is, I think, an important distinction. But could I just say one thing more about this, just to illustrate the subtleties and the complexities about the political and social significance of discourse about method. There is a wonderful book that's just come out by Laura Snyder, spelled S-N-Y-D-E-R. And the title is Reforming Philosophy. Reforming Philosophy. It's one of the best books I've read for a long time. And it's all about the controversy between William Whewell, whom you had on the screen a few minutes ago, and John Stuart Mill, one of the great philosophers of the liberal tradition. And what makes the book so interesting is that both Mill and Whewell claimed to be advocating the correct inductive method. Both of them claimed to be doing the correct inductive method. And yet, as Snyder shows, they disagreed on almost every point as to what that method actually was. Mill was deeply critical of Whewell's philosophy because he thought it was socially and politically conservative, giving too much ground to intuition rather than to direct experience of phenomena. So I'm making the point there that you can very innocently talk about the inductive method in science, but the moment you do, you need to make sure you know what you're talking about, because in the past there have been deep debates about what that actually means and what social and political consequences follow from a particular methodology. Does that help us?
Oh, sorry. Can we go to one at the back, because our tape's running out, so there will be more time for questions.
I was deeply interested by your model, which implies the existence of a third term, like with Tycho Brahe, for example. And I deeply agree with you that Simon Conway Morris is a sort of Tycho Brahe of our time. But my question is, can you apply this very interesting methodology to other debate, for example, on anthropic principle, or where there are a huge debate between opponent and supporter of a link between science and religion? And a second short question is, what are the other possible Tycho Brahe in the field of biology between Richard Dawkins and strong Darwinist and intelligent design? Are there other Tycho Brahe like Simon Conway Morris for you?
Right, well, that's a very nice question, We can talk about this for the rest of the conference, I think. On the anthropic principle, I mean, it does seem to me that we are not dealing just with two extremes. There are extreme positions. I've noticed, for example, that a fairly conservative philosopher of religion like Richard Swinburne accuses those who invent the multiverse of inventing a multiverse simply to escape the conclusions of what would otherwise be a fairly straightforward inference to design. I think there are cosmologists like Lee Smolin, for example, who would strenuously deny that that's all he's inventing the multiverse for. It does actually have a strategic role in the way he constructs the cosmology. So I think there would be quite a lot of intermediate positions, even supposing one accepts the reality of not just a multiverse. Let's go for the lot and say, an infinite number of multiverses. Does that necessarily show that those multiverses don't have a creator of some kind? I mean, it doesn't seem to follow at all, to my mind. So there are a whole kind of range of intermediate positions that you would be able to map out. Whereas the extreme positions just seem to gather their momentum from the very fact that they are, in some sense, entrenched in a polemic which often does have religious, social and political overtones.
Okay, our tape has 1 minute left. It doesn't mean to say we can't carry on questions, but is there another one? Or probably we'll make this the last question over here then. Yes, if you, thank you. Yeah.
The main thrust of what you've been talking about tonight has been science and its interaction with Christianity in the West. Yeah, and I was wondering to what extent you've touched on, you've made passing references to other religions. And I was just wondering to what extent there's been a similar dialogue over a long period of time in other religions. For example, would there be a professor of science and religion in an Islamic university?
I've been in the presence of senior Muslims in roundtable discussions when these kind of issues have arisen. And they have sometimes said, I'm going to say something now which I can say within these four walls, but could not say outside. There are, I think, particularly strong social pressures which make it very difficult to have a discourse of this kind without seeming to be calling into question the sacred text. And Jean will know that we had a conference in Oxford just a few months ago where we had a group of Christian scientists and a group of Muslim scientists discussing these issues. We were privileged to have you, Dennis, there as well. And what I found very intriguing was the line that seemed to be consistent despite a kind of very interesting disparity of views on them. But there was this line that if there is an issue which is actually discussed in the Quran, then the Quran has to be the first port of call for the solution to that issue. If the issue is not dealt with in the Quran, then there is freedom to debate, of course. But I did find that very interesting. That the implication seemed to be that there are some issues, and there are issues which no doubt do touch on questions of creation. That presupposition that the Quran has to take priority if it does clearly speak to the issue. Now, the analogy of that in the Christian tradition would be a particular form of Reformed Protestant theology in the 16th century, where it was sometimes assumed that you could go to Scripture in order to resolve some kind of dispute in natural philosophy. But I think it's true to say that in the West, that particular use of Scripture gradually fizzled out. It has not played a prominent role in scientific discourse in the West.
Okay, I know we have a Muslim scholar here. I don't know if anyone wants to contribute to that particular discussion. You don't have to, I just thought it would be useful, because I know we may have one or more Muslim scholars here from that part of the world, and if there was anything to say on that, it would be helpful to hear, but maybe there may be other occasions for that. I would just like to add to that point. I actually taught science for 15 years in the Muslim world, in universities there, and I would say it's just very, very diverse. I mean, although I'd agree with what John said, there's a huge diversity throughout the Muslim world, and it so happened actually the universities where I was teaching were far more secular than Cambridge University. I could say that. So I think there's a huge diversity of places and locations, to come back to a point that John was making earlier. I think we've had a great start to this weekend. We've worked John hard already. I know you've had a long day on your time. We want to thank John very much indeed for